he turned the key and said, "You're not leaving me again." The sound of that lock clicking still echoes in my chest like a heartbeat I can't quiet. I stood by the door with my suitcase half zipped, my hand trembling over the handle. Ethan was standing only a few feet away, his eyes fixed on mine, calm, steady, but filled with something I couldn't name. The air between us felt too still, too heavy, as if the house itself knew something was about to break. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It was low, almost pleading. "You always run when things get hard." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. That line, it wasn't anger. It was memory. And it pierced straight through every wall I'd built to keep the past buried. I wanted to believe this was just frustration, that he was tired, hurt, maybe scared. But then I saw his hands. They were shaking. Not from rage, but from something deeper. I whispered his name, hoping the sound of it might soften him. Instead, he looked at me the way a drowning man looks at air. Desperate, terrified, and certain that if he lets go, he'll lose everything. That's when I realized this wasn't about control. It was about loss. And that terrified me more than the locked door ever could. I took a step closer, keeping my voice calm. "Ethan, please. I just need some time away." His jaw tightened. "You said that before," he murmured. "You said it after Dad died. You said it when you left the first time." The way he said left made it sound like a crime. I wanted to scream that it wasn't my fault, that I had spent years keeping this house together while grief swallowed us both. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw something haunting. He wasn't angry at me for leaving. He was angry at me for coming back. For a moment, silence wrapped around us. I could hear the rain outside tapping against the window, soft but insistent, like the echo of a past we both pretended to forget. My mind flashed back to the promise I made to his father the night before he died. I was sitting beside Daniel's hospital bed, holding his cold hand. His voice, faint but sure, said, "Promise me you'll stay. Promise you won't leave Ethan alone." I said yes without thinking, without realizing that promise would one day become a chain around both our hearts. I blinked, and suddenly I was back in that dim living room, the present pressing down on me like a weight. Ethan's breath was uneven now, like he was fighting something inside him. "You think you can just walk away?" he said quietly. "After everything?" I tried to keep my tone steady, to reason with him, but every word came out like a confession. "Ethan, I've done everything I could for you. But this isn't right. You can't just lock me in." He took one step forward, and for the first time, I saw tears in his eyes. "You're the only person who ever stayed," he whispered. "If you go, I'll have nothing left." That broke me, because deep down I knew the pain he spoke of. I knew what it felt like to lose everyone you loved, to hold on to the one thing that reminded you of what used to be. But love born out of grief is never gentle. It binds, it suffocates, it turns tenderness into fear. And as I looked at Ethan, I felt that fear rising inside me, twisting itself into guilt. What would you do if someone said they couldn't live without you, and you believed them? Would you stay out of compassion or run out of self-preservation? I asked myself that question as he stood there, his hand still gripping the key in his pocket. I took a slow breath, searching his face for the boy I once knew. The boy who used to leave flowers at his mother's portrait, who'd sit silently on the stairs waiting for his father's car to pull in. But that boy was gone. All that remained was a man haunted by loss, clinging to me as if I were his last piece of the past. I reached out, gently placing my hand on his arm. "Ethan, look at me." He did. His expression softened for a moment, just long enough for me to see the loneliness underneath. "I'm not running," I said. "I just need to breathe." His lip trembled. "That's what Mom said before she left." The words hit like a knife. I could see the pain flooding back into his face, the same pain he'd carried since he was 16. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about me leaving. It was about every person who'd ever walked out on him. But what happened next left me speechless. Instead of arguing, Ethan turned away and pressed his forehead against the door. "I can't lose another one," he whispered. His voice cracked on the last word. That small sound, that breaking, felt louder than any scream. I wanted to tell him he wasn't losing me, but I couldn't lie. I'd already decided I had to go. Staying here meant suffocating both of us in the past. Still, I couldn't move. My suitcase slipped from my hand and landed with a soft thud against the floor. Minutes passed in silence. Then he turned back to me, his face calm again, but his eyes wet. "You made him a promise," he said. "You told Dad you'd stay." My throat tightened. "I did," I said softly. "But promises change when people do." That was when he smiled. Not a happy smile, but one that held something dark, something fragile. "Then maybe I have to remind you who you promised to be." And before I could respond, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the old brass key, and turned it in the lock. The sound was final, sharp, metallic, echoing through the house like a verdict. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to shout, to demand, to fight. But when I looked into his face, I saw no malice. Just grief. A kind of desperate love that didn't know where to go. I thought he was angry. I whisper now, years later, remembering that moment. But when I saw his hands shaking, I knew this was something else. He wasn't trying to trap me. He was trying to stop time, to keep his world from collapsing one more time. Still, I couldn't stay in that room forever. Something inside me whispered that love shouldn't hurt like this. I took one cautious step forward and said, "Ethan, please open the door." He didn't move. His gaze fell to the floor, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "You said you'd never leave me." There was no accusation, no threat, just a heartbreaking truth that cut straight through me. And then, as if the air itself had shifted, he whispered something else, something that would haunt me for years to come, words that shattered the wall I'd built between past and present. He looked straight into my eyes and said, "You don't even remember what you promised me that night, do you?" That's when the truth began to unfold. And I realized, with a chill that reached my bones, that this moment wasn't just about love or grief. It was about a secret I'd buried so deep, I almost forgot it existed. And that's when he whispered the truth that shattered every wall I'd built around my heart. When I close my eyes, I can still smell that house, a mix of cedar, old books, and the faintest trace of Daniel's cologne that never truly faded. No matter how many times I tried to air the rooms out, that house wasn't just walls and windows. It was a memory that refused to die, and I was the one trapped inside it. Ethan and I moved through those halls like two ghosts keeping each other company, pretending to live while mourning the same man in completely different ways. I used to tell myself I stayed for Ethan, to help him heal, to give him stability. But deep down, I think I stayed because leaving meant admitting that the life I built was already over. I still remember the first time Ethan called me Mom. He said it quietly, almost testing the sound, as if afraid the word might break something between us. I smiled then. I thought it meant healing. Daniel had been gone 6 months, and we were just starting to laugh again, to find rhythm in the silence. But over time, something shifted. He stopped calling me Mom. He'd linger too long at the dining table, watching me as I moved around the kitchen. Sometimes when I asked what he was thinking, he'd just say, "You remind me of him," but softer. That line stayed with me. It felt like a compliment and a warning all at once. In the evenings, when the house grew too quiet, I'd sit by the fireplace with a book, and Ethan would join me. He'd sit across from me, never beside me, and talk about his father. The way Daniel laughed, the way he worked, the promises he never kept. And then somehow the conversations would shift. He'd ask me how I felt when I first met Daniel, how I knew he was the one if I ever thought about leaving. Those questions made me uneasy. They weren't the questions of a grieving boy. They were the questions of someone studying me. Someone who wanted to understand what made me stay, and what might make me go. One night, as I folded laundry, I heard him on the phone in the next room. His voice was low, but I caught one sentence clearly. "She's all I have left." I won't let her go. My heart dropped. I told myself he was talking about me as family, as someone he didn't want to lose. But part of me already knew that wasn't the truth. I wanted to believe in the kindness I'd raised him to have, the decency I'd protected. I wanted to believe grief was confusing him. But grief doesn't look at you like that. Grief doesn't linger in doorways or touch your hand like it's afraid you'll disappear. What would you do if someone's care started feeling like control? That's what I keep asking myself now. Because at first I thought it was sweet, the way Ethan insisted on driving me to the market, or how he'd scold me gently for skipping meals. But soon it became rules. You shouldn't drive alone at night. You don't need to go into town today. Dad wanted you safe. His words were always calm, careful, never cruel. But they carried a quiet authority, like he was speaking on behalf of someone who was gone. I didn't see it for what it was. A tightening circle around my life, disguised as protection. But what happened next left me speechless. One evening, while cleaning the bedroom drawers, I found Daniel's old watch. Only, it wasn't where I'd left it. It was placed carefully beside a folded letter, written in Ethan's handwriting. I shouldn't have opened it. But something inside me, fear, maybe, made me read. The letter wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to his father. It said, "I kept her here, Dad, just like you wanted. She still wears your ring. She still sleeps on your side. She still belongs to us." My hands shook as I read those words. Every line felt like a window cracking open in a storm, the truth pouring in faster than I could close it. Ethan wasn't protecting me. He was preserving me. He'd built a life around keeping Daniel's world untouched, as if I were a relic in a shrine neither of us could escape. That's when I realized the house wasn't a home anymore. It was a memory turned into a prison. That night, I tried to confront him. I held the letter in my trembling hands and asked, "Why would you write this?" He didn't answer at first. He just stared, his eyes unreadable. Then he said, "Because I promised him." His tone was gentle, almost loving, but behind it was something hollow, something that scared me more than anger ever could. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave the next morning, take whatever I could carry, and never look back. But as I stood in that empty hallway, the shadows stretched long and familiar, I realized something chilling. I didn't know where away was anymore. Every part of me had been tied to that house, by memories, by guilt, by a boy who had turned into a man who couldn't let go. I thought his kindness was love. I didn't know it was becoming something else, and when I found that letter, the one written in devotion and delusion, I understood the truth too late. That house didn't just hold memories, it fed on them. And I was next. Because the moment I decided to pack my bags and leave, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone who already knew what I was going to do. And when I turned around, Ethan was standing there. He smiled softly and said, "You don't have to be afraid." But I was, because that's when I realized I was living in a house built on obsession, not love. When I first read the letter, I thought it was a mistake, that Daniel never meant for me to see it. His handwriting was shaky, the ink uneven, like he'd written it in the middle of the night when the truth finally became too heavy to hold. I remember sitting at the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in my hands as I read his words. "Forgive me. I loved you so completely I forgot my son was watching. Set him free before my love becomes his curse." Those lines split something open inside me. I couldn't breathe. For years, I'd wondered if Daniel had ever noticed how Ethan's eyes followed me, how his voice softened when he spoke to me, how he'd wait by the window for me to come home. Now I knew he had. And worse, he'd left me to fix it. I folded the letter, pressed it against my chest, and cried for a man who had burdened me with his guilt. Daniel loved us both, but he'd broken something neither of us could repair. I wanted to burn that letter to pretend it never existed, but instead I locked it away. I told myself Ethan didn't need to know, that protecting him from the truth was the only way to set him free. But what I didn't realize was that by keeping that secret, I was doing the opposite. I wasn't setting him free. I was binding him tighter to me, to the version of us Daniel had left behind. The days that followed felt strange. Ethan had started renovating parts of the house, like he was trying to erase time itself. He said it was for me. "You shouldn't have to live with broken things," he'd whisper. But I knew he wasn't fixing the house. He was preserving it. Every nail, every coat of paint, every repaired wall was a way of keeping the past alive. When he restored Daniel's study, I couldn't bring myself to go in. That room had been untouched for years, a sanctuary I couldn't face. But one evening, I heard soft music playing from behind the door. Curiosity got the better of me, and when I stepped inside, I froze. He'd framed a photograph. Only it wasn't Daniel's, it was mine. A picture I didn't even remember being taken. Me in the garden, sunlight on my face, laughing at something out of frame. Ethan looked up when I entered. There was no guilt in his expression, no panic. Just quiet certainty. He said, "You were the only thing that ever made this house feel alive." The air between us changed in that moment, heavy, suffocating. I wanted to tell him it was wrong, that he was confusing memory for love, but the words caught in my throat. Because part of me understood. We were both trapped in a home that refused to let either of us move on. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake hearing Daniel's words echoing through the walls. Set him free. But how do you free someone who doesn't want to be saved? I told myself I'd take a break, just a few days away. I'd visit my sister in the city, breathe different air, think clearly. But the morning I was supposed to leave, I woke up feverish. My body ached, my head throbbed, and when I called out for help, Ethan was already there. He pressed a cool cloth to my forehead and said softly, "You can't go anywhere like this." At first, I thought it was coincidence. Bad timing, nothing more. But then it happened again. Every time I tried to plan a trip, something went wrong. Once it was a storm that cut the power for 2 days. Another time, the car wouldn't start. And always, there he was, quietly, patiently, convincing me it was safer to stay. His voice was never harsh, never demanding, just steady and sure. "You've been through enough," he'd say. "You need rest." But what happened next left me breathless. One evening, as I walked down the hall, I heard him talking. Not to me, but to someone. I followed the voice to the study door, just slightly ajar. Inside, Ethan was sitting in Daniel's old chair, holding the framed photo of me. He was whispering, "She doesn't understand yet, Dad. But she will." My hand flew to my mouth to stop the sound that almost escaped. I stepped back quietly, heart pounding, realizing the depth of the illusion he'd built. He wasn't talking to his father. He was talking for him, keeping the ghost alive through me. I thought I was protecting him. But he was protecting the version of me that never existed. The woman frozen in that photograph. Smiling, gentle, unchanged. Not the one who'd grown older, lonelier, more desperate to leave. He didn't want me. He wanted who I had been when Daniel was alive. When I confronted him about it, his expression barely changed. He just said, "You're the only home I've ever had." Something inside me broke then. I realized he wasn't asking for love. He was asking me to remember who I used to be, to fill the empty space his father left behind. And that's when the fear truly began to sink in, because I understood that no matter how far I ran, he'd find a way to pull me back. One night, I packed my bags quietly, planning to leave before sunrise. I didn't care where I'd go. Anywhere would be better than staying trapped in that house. But as I reached for the front door, the handle didn't move. The lock had been turned from the inside. My hands trembled. I turned to call out, but before I could speak, Ethan appeared in the doorway, calm as ever. He looked at my suitcase, then at me, and smiled faintly. "You shouldn't be alone out there," he said. His tone was soft, almost tender, but there was something final in it. Something that made my blood run cold. I tried to reason with him, told him this wasn't healthy, that we both needed space to heal. But he only stepped closer, his voice low and trembling. "You always run when things get hard." Those were the same words he'd said years later, the words that would echo in my head as he turned the key and locked me inside for good. That night, as I sat on the floor by the door, staring at the empty house around me, I realized the truth. I had spent years trying to save him from his father's shadow, never realizing that I'd become the shadow myself. And when I finally gathered the courage to stand, his footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow, certain, and heartbreakingly calm, because that was the night he refused to let me go. And I realized what he truly wanted. The night I tried to leave began with silence. Not the gentle kind that soothes you before sleep, no. This was the kind that presses against your chest until breathing feels like betrayal. I had spent the whole day pretending to read, pretending to cook, pretending that my hands weren't shaking every time I brushed past Ethan in the hallway. But as the clock struck 10, I made my choice. I folded a letter, placed it on the kitchen counter, and packed the last of my things into a suitcase that suddenly felt too heavy to carry. The storm outside had started hours ago. Wind lashing against the windows, rain beating down like the sky was warning me not to go. Still, I whispered to myself, "It's now or never." Ethan was sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp painting half his face in gold, half in shadow. He didn't speak when he saw the suitcase. He didn't need to. His eyes followed me, quiet but sharp, as if memorizing each movement. I told him calmly, "I'm leaving for a while. I'll stay with my sister. I need space. He didn't respond. Just nodded once, his jaw tight. For a moment, I thought maybe he understood. Maybe he'd let me go. But when I turned the knob, I heard it, the faint, deliberate click of the lock sliding into place. I froze. The air between us thickened. Slowly, I turned around. He stood a few feet away, hands trembling, tears gathering in his eyes. And then he said it, the words that made my heart stop. "You can't leave me too." I wanted to shout, to scream, to tell him this wasn't about leaving him. It was about saving us both. But when I saw his face, all I could see was a boy who had lost everything. His voice broke as he continued. "First Dad left, and then you stopped laughing. You stopped cooking on Sundays. You stopped looking at me. I thought if I could just keep you here, maybe I could make it right again." That's when it hit me. He wasn't trying to trap me. He was trying to hold time still, to freeze the moment before everything fell apart. I whispered his name, reaching out instinctively, but he backed away like my touch might burn. The storm outside roared louder, lightning flashing across the room, throwing his shadow across the wall like something alive. My voice shook as I said, "Ethan, this isn't love. This is grief wearing his face." He sank to the floor then, knees to his chest like a child lost in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. I stood there, suitcase in hand, not knowing whether to comfort him or run. The rain pounded harder, the lights flickered, and for one fleeting second, I saw Daniel's ghost in the reflection of the window. Not literally, but in the way Ethan curled into himself, just like his father used to when the world became too much. I dropped the suitcase. I couldn't walk away from that kind of pain. I sat beside him, my hands trembling as I whispered, "You don't need to keep me here to keep him close." He looked up at me, eyes wide, raw. "But that's just it," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't know how to let go. Every corner of this house feels like him. And you. If you go, there's nothing left." His words broke me open. All the anger, the guilt, the confusion, it came pouring out. I told him how I'd spent years trying to be strong, pretending that I wasn't lonely, that Daniel's death hadn't hollowed me out too. I told him that every time he looked at me with that same grief, it made it impossible to heal. We cried together, not as mother and son, not even as two people trapped by loss, but as two broken souls finally facing the truth. For a long moment, the storm outside went silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I reached out and touched his shoulder. He didn't pull away this time. And in that fragile stillness, I saw what Daniel's letter had tried to warn me. That love, when twisted by grief, can turn into a cage. Ethan didn't need punishment. He needed release, but what happened next left me speechless. He stood slowly, wiped his eyes, and unlocked the door. "Go," he said softly. Before I changed my mind, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to stay, to make sure he'd be okay, but another part, the part that still remembered who I used to be, whispered that leaving was the only way either of us could survive. I stepped outside. The wind hit my face, cold and fierce, and I could barely see through the rain. Behind me, I heard the door close. Not slam, just close, quiet, and deliberate. I didn't look back. I walked to the car, hands shaking, heart racing, telling myself that this was freedom, that I'd finally broken the pattern, but when the sun rose the next morning, the world didn't feel free. My phone buzzed with missed calls, and then came the one message that made my blood run cold. A neighbor's voice, panicked, saying the police were at the house, because when they knocked on my door that morning, the truth about what happened that night finally came out. The sound of the rain hadn't stopped when the knock came. It was sharp, official, the kind that slices through silence. I remember how the blue and red lights bled through the curtains, mixing with the gray morning. 2 officers stood at the door, dripping from the storm, eyes scanning the wreckage behind me, the shattered vase, the overturned chair, the trail of tears on the floor. One of them asked softly, "Ma'am, are you safe?" I wanted to say yes, but the truth trembled somewhere between my ribs. Ethan sat on the floor beside me, hands clasped, staring at the wall like a man caught between guilt and grief. He didn't run. He didn't protest. He just whispered, "I didn't mean to scare her. I just didn't want her to go." They looked at me, waiting for an answer that would decide everything. I could feel their eyes weighing my silence, the chaos around us, the bruise on my wrist that wasn't from anger but from trying to open the locked door. I swallowed hard and said, "He didn't hurt me. He was just lost. But the words sounded weak, like a cracked umbrella in the storm. They spoke to him gently, asked him questions he could barely answer. He confessed everything, how he locked the door, how he panicked, how he thought if he could just stop me from leaving, maybe his world wouldn't fall apart again. His voice broke when he said, "I thought if I kept her close, I'd still have him." For a moment, even the officers went quiet. It wasn't the confession of a criminal. It was the cry of a broken boy wearing a man's face. I remember wanting to hold him, to tell them all that this wasn't about control. It was about grief wearing a cruel disguise. But what could I say? The law doesn't measure heartbreak. It measures actions. And his actions had crossed a line, even if love had blurred it. They took him gently by the arm, told him he needed to come with them for evaluation. He didn't resist. He just turned to me and said softly, "Don't let the rain wash this away." When the door closed behind him, I stood there in the silence he left behind. The house smelled of rain and dust and something else, something final. I sat down where he had been moments ago, tracing the imprint his hands had left on the floor. That's when the realization sank in. He wasn't trying to trap me. He was trying to hold time still. But time doesn't listen. It moves mercilessly. Days turned into weeks. The house became too quiet, too clean. I tried to repaint the walls, fix the broken glass, even replace the door he once locked, but nothing could erase that night. Every creak of the wood, every flicker of thunder outside felt like a ghost knocking. I got word that he was released after a few months, that he'd decided to leave town, to find himself, they said. I didn't ask where. I didn't want to, because sometimes love means letting someone disappear. One afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address. No name on the envelope. Just my name written in the same shaky handwriting that used to scribble grocery lists on the fridge. My heart trembled before I even opened it. Inside, there was only one line. "Thank you for setting me free. I understand now." The paper smelled faintly of rain. I sat there for hours, just staring at those words. It wasn't an apology, it was a release. For him, for me, for everything that had been broken between us. And yet part of me wished he'd written more, something about forgiveness or memories or love that doesn't hurt. But maybe that was his way of saying all of it. Sometimes, late at night, when the storm clouds gather and the house hums with that old familiar sound, I still hear his voice, faint, trembling, somewhere between regret and peace. And every time the rain begins to fall, I remember that night, and everything we couldn't say. I went back to the house after almost 10 years. It stood there quietly, the paint chipped, the garden wild, the same wind humming through the cracks in the porch. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, like memories had been waiting for me. Every wall still remembered our voices. Every floorboard creaked with something unsaid. I traced my fingers along the door that once held me prisoner and realized it wasn't the same door anymore. I had replaced it long ago, but the memory of that lock, that click that changed everything, was still buried somewhere inside me. Only this time I wasn't afraid. I was finally ready to give the house a new meaning. When I decided to turn it into a shelter, people told me it would be too painful, that I was asking to relive the worst part of my life. But I wasn't reliving it. I was rewriting it. The first night a woman arrived, her eyes swollen from crying, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw my past self in her. She stood at the same doorway where I once begged to be let out, and I told her softly, "You're safe here. No one locks doors in this house." She broke down in my arms. And that was the night I understood something no storm, no heartbreak, no lock could ever take from me. Survival isn't just living through it, it's using your pain to keep someone else alive. Ethan wrote to me sometimes. Never long letters, never dramatic, just a few lines, always in the same careful handwriting. The first one came 6 months after he left. It said, "I'm learning to be alone without being afraid." The second, a year later, I started painting again. The rain doesn't scare me now. Each letter was like a small piece of closure wrapped in forgiveness. I never wrote back, not because I didn't care, but because some stories don't need to be reopened. They just need to be remembered gently. Still, sometimes I caught myself wondering where he was. Did he ever walk by the ocean like he said he would? Did he ever find the peace that always seemed just out of reach? But every time my mind wandered there, I reminded myself, Not every ending needs reunion. Some endings are quiet, like two souls bowing to the truth before walking separate roads. The women who came to the shelter taught me as much as I taught them. One had left a marriage built on silence, another escaped a home where love meant control. Each of them carried stories that echoed mine, different faces, same ache. We'd sit together at night, sipping tea, sharing fragments of courage. Sometimes they'd ask me, "Do you ever forgive someone who trapped you out of love?" And every time I'd pause. Because how do you explain forgiveness that doesn't mean forgetting? I'd tell them this: forgiveness isn't saying what they did was right. It's saying it no longer owns you. And I'd see something shift in their eyes, a flicker of understanding, of release. Maybe that's why I named the shelter Two Doors. Because freedom, I learned, always comes with a choice. One door to walk through, one to never open again. Years passed, and the letters stopped. Life became gentler, the kind that doesn't demand explanations. I planted roses outside the shelter, red for pain, white for peace, and every spring they bloomed together, tangled but beautiful. Just like life itself. One afternoon, as the sun slipped through the windows, I found myself sitting by that same rebuilt door, a group of women laughing in the next room. And for the first time in years, I didn't hear the echo of that lock anymore. I heard freedom breathing, and that's when I realized it was never about him or me or even that night. It was about healing the parts of ourselves that believed we were unworthy of being free. The lock that once held me became a symbol, not of fear but of awakening. Because sometimes the same thing that trapped you can also teach you when it's time to walk away. So now, whenever someone new arrives at the shelter, eyes red, voice shaking, heart unsure, I tell them my story. Not to frighten them, but to remind them that love, when twisted by fear, stops being love at all. And when they ask how I found my strength, I just smile and say, freedom has two doors. One opens to escape, the other opens to understanding. And that's when I learned the truth. Freedom isn't walking away. It's knowing when not to stay.